So the big question is, how much has the departure from tradition actually damaged his stature in the Commons? Well, joining us now is the assistant editor at The Spectator, Cindy Yu. Really good to see you this morning. This is actually a very complicated story, but I think at the end, and the bottom line of this, is that they were all playing politics by using semantics, calling for different motions, different amendments being called forward. But we're also seeing the government now closing ranks around the Speaker, supporting the Speaker, and essentially turning fire back onto Labour.
Really smart, subtle move here, because what's happening here is that they're saying, oh no, hold on, wait, Lindsay Hoyle is not the problem, it's Keir Starmer or the people around him who have pressured Lindsay Hoyle and using the argument of MP safety to do that. And so the government is saying, as we heard the Prime Minister say just now, that the government doesn't agree with this kind of threat against MPs and we're not going to back down on it. Labour Party, Keir Starmer, are you saying that you're just going to back down in the face of extremist threats? And so it does turn the attack line around on Labour instead. And by protecting Lindsay Hoyle, they come across as magnanimous. But I think Lindsay Hoyle's position is still not necessarily safe because the SNP are totally incandescent about what's gone down this week because it was their motion that they couldn't vote on in the end. And so if the SNP is not happy with Lindsay Hoyle, that might be enough just to snowball that anyway.
I mean, yesterday morning, it was very unclear whether or not he could cling on for the day. He did. MPs heading back to their constituencies today over the weekend. By the time we get to Monday, do you think some of the heat will have been taken out of this, particularly with those interventions from James Cleverly, Penny Mordaunt yesterday? Yeah, I think so. I think the Conservative Party is now going to be saying to their MPs, you know, we're not going to be encouraging you to oppose Lindsay Hoyle. We saw some real anger from Conservatives on Wednesday night, but I think now that the party has decided this slightly different tactic to turn it around on Keir Starmer, I think at least the Conservative dogs will have been called off, as it were. And I think there's the other thing, which is that there's no formal way of getting rid of Lindsay Hoyle. So unless he can basically feel like the entire House is against him, you know, there's no formal mechanism to trigger to get rid of the Speaker. And so I think he probably will be safe, but watch the space.
What do you say to people watching this morning who are saying, I'm having difficulty paying my energy bill, putting food on the table? Here they are, dancing around semantics, when you've got the SNP calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, Labour calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, and the Conservatives asking for an immediate humanitarian pause. Not a ceasefire, a pause, and a permanent, sustainable ceasefire. There we are. So the point is, actually, this is all irrelevant anyway, because it's not as though you've got foreign powers watching what's going on in the House of Commons here, is it?
Well, I hope they're not watching.
Well, no, I hope they're not.
It certainly doesn't reflect us in a good light, does it?
No, it doesn't. I can definitely see the anger, you know, from your texter, for example, who says we've got energy bills we can't pay, you know, all this sort of stuff. Domestic issues are not being solved right now. We've got a housing crisis, we've got a cost of living crisis, all of these things. But I would say that foreign policy is important in terms of what the British government does when it comes to Gaza and Israel. It is important to the people in Gaza. You know, that is an important thing to be settling down on. And the sad thing is that clearly all three major parties think that there is some kind of ceasefire to be had in Gaza, but none of them are talking about what that is.
Can I just ask you very quickly on the Telegraph? Islamists are now in control, says Braverman. So this is certainly stirring up some rhetoric here. We saw those images being portrayed onto Big Ben as well, from the river to the sea. Very inflammatory indeed. The police seem to do nothing, and politicians saying they are frightened for their own lives.
It's shocking, really. And then there are people getting death threats, people who've made death threats being imprisoned but then released, and stalkers and all this sort of stuff. So it is terrifying, I think. And I think it's always going to be like this. You know, politics shouldn't be like this, but because it's such an emotive and sectarian, frankly, issue, it is tricky to see how politicians can do their job without people in the country feeling very strongly about it. I'm not really sure what the police can do whilst also protecting people's rights to protest. I mean, there's obviously a red line in certain cases, and we've seen that being prosecuted and arrested. But yeah, there's no good answer for it. But I think when we come to protesters, you know, they need to think about, is it fair that they're putting people under threat for their families, their parents, all this sort of stuff?